Hello and welcome to my June reading wrap-up. In the month of June I took part in the Shelf Space Olympics readathon and it was won by Team Poseidon, who was captained by Abby from the channel Abby Salter, so round of applause for them. I managed to read 16 books in the month of June. Not all of them were for prompts. I actually ended up reading 2 that didn't count for any prompts, but I did read 16 books in total. So I am going to go through them, but this will probably be a long video, which is hardly surprising from me anyway, so let us get into it. The first 2 books that I read, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on because I am actually going to be talking about those in a separate video and I don't want to repeat myself too much. So the first one I read was From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout, and because of the red on the cover, this is the book that I read for Dionysus, which was my team. Hello, if any of you are watching, I miss our group chat. Feel free to come over to my Discord to hang out with me if you would like. So I read that one first, and then for the Poseidon prompt I read Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. Again, I'm going to be talking about this one in a separate video, so I'm not going to talk about it for now. And then from there I read Son of the Storm by Suyi Davies Okumboa for the Artemis prompt. This is a new release. I think it came out in May, maybe early June, I can't quite remember, but it is very, very new out. And it is an African-inspired fantasy that follows, what's his name again? Danso, who is a scholar, although not a particularly good one. He doesn't necessarily follow the rules and he doesn't really feel like he belongs in the city of Basso where he lives. And then a magic user enters the city and he kind of gets caught up in this situation. The magic user isn't supposed to be there and he ends up leaving the city and all sorts of things ensue. Now, I found this book a little bit on the slow side to begin with, and I was originally trying to read this just physically, but I ended up just buying using a credit for the audiobook through Audible because I was just finding it far too slow, and I think it's a slow-paced book anyway, and I'm a very slow physical reader, and that can really impact upon my enjoyment of a book. And I overall didn't love this as much as I hoped because I thought that we were going into this book to read about a scholar doing scholarly things in a way that the other scholars didn't approve of, but actually what we ended up having was kind of a travelling fantasy story, which is never really my favourite thing, so it didn't end up working for me quite so well. I don't rule out continuing with the series because this is the first book in a new series. I don't know the name of the series though. Oh, the Nameless Republic series, but it's not going to be a high priority, to be honest, to continue with this series. I really like the setting, I really like the premise of the characters, but unfortunately the plot just wasn't really my thing. Next up, I read Never World Wake by Marisha Pessel for the Hades prompt. This story follows, I can never remember any characters' names, B, whose boyfriend and best friend died a year ago? Yeah, a year ago, and she's kind of fallen out of touch with their group of friends as a result, but it's the birthday of one of these friends and so she goes to visit them. She's still really struggling with the death of her partner, and they go out and through circumstances that I won't explain, they basically die and get stuck in a time loop where they have to decide who out of their number is going to survive while everyone else remains dead, and they can't leave repeating this day until they make that decision. It has to be a unanimous decision. This was actually quite an interesting story. I liked the premise and I felt like the story did pay off on that premise. That's exactly what the book is about, and I liked the characters fine. They weren't necessarily my favourite characters ever, but I didn't find them incredibly annoying. It got a little bit repetitive, but you kind of expect that with a time loop style story. And overall, I quite liked that kind of sci-fi element to the story, but the mystery element to the story I didn't find engaging at all. I found it partially predictable and partially I just didn't really care about that mystery element of the story, so I do kind of wish that it had leaned slightly more to the sci-fi side rather than the mystery side, but it was still a fun, easy, quick read. From there, I read my favourite book of the month, which was Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell, which I read for the Hestia prompt, and I absolutely adored this book. The characters in this were just so fantastic. Their names were Kiem and Jinen. See, I told you, rubbish with the names. Kiem and Jinen, so fantastic. Basically, Jinen is married to Kiem's cousin, Prince Tom, but Prince Tom dies, and for various political reasons, Jinen needs to remarry, and he ends up marrying Kiem. They don't really know each other. Things are very awkward, but also there's this suspicion that Prince Tom was actually murdered rather than having died in an accident as previously thought, and so they're investigating that. Now, although I said I didn't enjoy the mystery element in Neverwhelmed Wake, I did really enjoy the mystery element in this. Was it slightly predictable? Yes, but I really didn't care because I was just so engaged by these characters and their relationship with each other and the development of that relationship. It was a very engaging story. It's a very character-driven story, which is possibly why this one worked so much better for me in terms of the mystery elements than this one, because this one is a very plot-driven book and I'm a character-driven reader, so this definitely worked better for me on that side of things. But I also just really enjoyed the politics that these characters were dealing with. It's a slightly sci-fi, slightly fantasy type world. The actual world that they were in was really, really interesting, and there's a scene wherein they're in the mountains in the snow that was just so atmospheric, and I really enjoyed that. So this one was a massive win. This will be on my favourites list for the year, 100%, no doubt in my mind. I already am looking forward to rereading it. Fantastic. Next up for my Apollo prompt, I read Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds, which is actually a story written in verse, and it takes place over just several minutes whilst the character is in a lift, or if you're American, in an elevator, travelling downstairs. His brother has been murdered and he is intent on revenge. So he's travelling down in this lift with a gun in his belt, in his back pocket, whatever it is, and he's being visited by a number of people as he stops at each floor on the way down, and they're talking to him about their experiences and the wisdom or not of the decision that he's making. I don't want to say too much more than that because it's written in verse, so it's really quite short in terms of the plot arc, not just in terms of, you know, the length of the narrative, but also the length of time that we're covering here. And I don't want to say too much about it because I feel like it's so easy to spoil a book that's as short as this one is. I liked it, I enjoyed it, it's a very quick read, I think it's a worthwhile read. It has some really interesting themes involved. There's a graphic novel version, so if you feel like you don't really want to read something that's in verse, then maybe try out the graphic novel. I'm somebody who doesn't really tend to get on too well with poetry, but this worked fine for me. I wasn't confused or anything like that. If you're kind of familiar with poetry and reading things in verse, then you'd probably get more out of it than I did, but I still enjoyed it. I appreciated it for what it was and I recommend it. It's not very long. I think it's worth taking the 1 or 2 hours if that it will take you to read it. Then I read the 2 books that weren't towards any of the prompts. So the first one I read was Ask the Passengers by A.S. King. I just couldn't fit this into any of the prompts, but I had picked it up and decided I wanted to read it straight away, so I did. This one is contemporary but with some speculative fiction elements. So we follow Astrid, who likes to talk to aeroplanes as they pass by overhead, and there is suggestion within the text that the messages that she is sending are reaching these aeroplanes and making some difference to the passengers that are hearing them. So that's kind of the speculative element to the story, but the vast majority of the plot is contemporary in style, but it's a very character-driven book, which I don't know necessarily is always the case with contemporary fiction. So it is very focused on Astrid and her experiences with the difficulties of defining herself as a person and the need to define herself to herself and to other people, the lack of acceptance that she experiences both from family and friends. This is queer. I'm not going to go into in what ways because I feel like the exploration of that is an important part of the story. I found that so many people in this were just so awful. They were awful people, that's the point. But it did make for difficult reading in places, but this is a very kind of character-driven book. That's really the only way to explain it. Not much really happens in terms of plot. It's all about self-exploration, self-discovery, and the way that you deal with people who are so unaccepting of the person that you are, and how difficult that is when you don't even really understand the person that you are. So I really enjoyed reading this, but it is very, very different to anything else that I would usually read. I enjoyed it anyway, but I can see this one being really hit and miss for people. Also, if you want more information on that book and on A.S. King in general, then I would recommend going over to Kayla from Books and Lala's channel, because she talks about A.S. King quite a lot and she is far more useful than I will ever be on that particular author. And the next book that I read that again wasn't for any of the prompts was The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which is a classic and a very, very short book. I think according to Storygraph it's only 64 pages long. It's very, very short, and it's about a woman who, it's not confirmed on page, but she's essentially suffering from postpartum depression, and this is set in the kind of late 1800s, so not really that long ago, but the late 1800s, and her husband is a doctor, so is her brother, and they have decided that she needs to be isolated to deal with her postpartum depression, because separating her from her baby and everyone else in her life and anything that might bring her joy is clearly an excellent treatment plan. Back then, mental health was really, really badly misunderstood. I could talk about that topic for ages. If you'd be interested in me doing that, let me know. I'm happy to. Mental health and mental health law and mental health treatment is something that I'm really kind of personally interested in. It's something that I teach at work, so you know, if you'd be interested in that, let me know. But the point is, the book follows the deterioration in her mental state as a result of that treatment plan. And I did mostly read it for work, but I had been planning on reading it for years, finally got around to it. I don't know why it took me so long considering how short it is, but this is one of those books where I don't want to say I enjoyed it, because I don't know if you can really enjoy a book like that, but I'm really glad I read it. I would encourage anyone to read it. It's listed as horror. I don't really think it's horror, to be honest, depending on whether or not it would trigger you. If you were triggered by it, then yes, it would be horror. But otherwise, it's not really kind of scary in the traditional sense. It's scary the way that people treated other people back then, but that's a whole other topic of conversation. Next up, I read The Reluctant Queen by Sarah Beth Durst for the Hero Prompt. This is book 2 in the Queens of Renthia series, so I'm not going to tell you what this particular book is about, but the first book is set in a forest, as you can kind of tell from the cover, and this forest is inhabited by humans and by spirits, and these spirits are incredibly destructive in nature. They don't want these humans in their forest, they want them out, and so the Queen of Renthia, who is the most powerful magic user, is responsible for keeping these spirits under control so that they don't cause mass destruction. But things start going wrong and mass destruction starts to ensue, and part of that mass destruction is the obliteration of Delena's hometown. Everyone apart from her and her family dies. This is an adult fantasy series, and it's relatively brutal in nature. It doesn't shy away from, you know, death and destruction. And Delena, by virtue of that event, discovers that she has magic, but, you know, she's not great at it. She goes off to a magic school, but, you know, she's kind of she tries really hard, but she's just not very good. And I won't go any further into the plot than that, but I love the atmosphere in these books. I really enjoy the characters. We get introduced to some new characters in this one. I really like them too. I enjoy the relationships. There's a little tiny weeny little bit of romance in here, but it's not dominant at all. It's very character focused, but the plot is still intriguing. I really like Sarah Beth Durst's writing. This is the 3rd book by her that I've read. Of course, I've read book 1 and book 2, and I also read Fire and Heist, which is a standalone YA fantasy. And if you're interested by Sarah Beth Durst and her works, then stay tuned, because something might be coming. More news on that soon. Next up, for the Demeter prompt, I read a Far love story, which quite clearly has food on the cover, and you will be hungry reading this one. That's just something I want to point out right off the bat. Have snacks at hand. This follows Lynn and Bao, whose families have rival Far restaurants, and as a result of that, they're not allowed to be friends, but they don't really understand why they're not allowed to be friends and why their families hate each other and are constantly competing. And they're literally across the road from each other, these restaurants. And so Lynn and Bao decide, do you know what, this is stupid, we're going to be friends anyway, and they try to get to the bottom of what it is that's going on between their families, and in the meantime there's clearly something going on between them from a romantic perspective, and there's also lots of really yummy food. This made me want to eat Vietnamese food all the time, so I enjoyed it and it made me hungry. Next up, I finally read The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater, which I read for the EOS prompt because this is the first book in a series, and I actually really enjoyed this, and it really wasn't at all what I was expecting. It's a little bit dark academia, it's a little bit mystery, it's a little bit fantasy, it's quite a lot darker than I was expecting. I was expecting quite a young, whimsical YA, and it really isn't that. It's a little bit on the dark side, which I kind of liked about it, and I actually am really interested in reading the rest of this series. It's difficult to explain what this is about. This follows a group of characters. Most of them attend this prestigious and expensive school. One of them doesn't, Blue. She is kind of a power bank for psychics. So her family are psychic. She's not psychic, but she can boost their powers, and so that's her thing. And then the boys are searching for something to do with the Arthurian legend, which I won't go into, and it's really difficult to explain what it's about, but I actually really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series. The reason I sound so surprised is because I didn't expect not to like it, but it just wasn't at all what I was expecting. So This was really good. And it's quite old now. I'm really late to this particular party. What's new? Then for Hephaestus, but equally this could have been for Nyx because I didn't get round to reading the Nyx book, I read Ember Queen by Laura Sebastian, which finally finished out the Ash Princess series. Again, can't really tell you what this one is about because it's the final book in the series, but the first book in the series follows Princess Thora or Theodosia. She has 2 names, and she witnessed at the age of 6 her mother being brutally murdered by the conquerors of her kingdom, and she was kept captive by them to be used and tortured in order to keep her people in line. But she wants to take back her land, and that's kind of the story of this series. I enjoyed this conclusion to the series. I had heard that the ending was really devastating and sad and surprising. I wasn't devastated, sad or surprised. Maybe I wasn't devastated or sad because I wasn't surprised. I kind of saw what was going to happen coming. If you didn't, I could see it being devastating and or sad if you were particularly connected to the characters. I was, but not as much as I could have been, not as much as I was with the characters in Winter's Orbit, for example. I liked these characters, I'm not kind of obsessed with them, but I am really glad that I finally finished reading this series. I did really enjoy it. It's fun. Again, a little bit on the darker side of YA, so if that's something that you're looking for, this could be a good one. It's kind of like, you know, this one and The Raven Boys feels a little bit like the upper end of YA starting to get towards adult. So yeah, I'm glad I read that one. I'm glad I read the series in general. I'm kind of trying to be quite quick now because already I've been filming for 25 minutes. My wrap-ups are always so long, I apologise. And then another book that I'm actually not going to talk about just now because I'm going to be talking about it in a different video was Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, which I read for the Zeus prompt. The stack is getting quite tall now and you can't even see the top of it. Then from there I read Docile, which I read for the Athena prompt. Docile is kind of sci-fi dystopian in style. Tons of trigger warnings for this book. They're written in the front of the book. Make sure you check them out before you decide to pick this one up. I have a reading vlog where I talked about this one, so I will link that for you. So I'm not going to talk about it at length here because again, this video is already really long. I really liked it. I'm really glad I read it. I thought it had really interesting discussions. I thought that the issues of consent were dealt with really well. Some readers have issues with it feeling like slave fiction, like slave fic as in like fanfic, but slave fic, and there not being good representation for the real life slavery that happened in our history. I can't speak to that. I'm not black. You know, I can see though why people would have those concerns, but I do think that the conversations that were had about consent were still important, so I would still recommend this book, but with that caution, along with please check the trigger warnings. Then for the Hermes prompt I read On Lunar Time by Amber Crawley, which is a novella, short story kind of thing. It's 200 pages, so I don't really know what you categorise that as, but it's the first book in a trilogy about a girl who discovers that she can travel to the past. So she does, and that's all I'm going to say because it's so short and a lot happens. I really enjoyed it. It is slightly kind of halfway between character driven and plot driven, but I enjoyed it nevertheless. It does end on a cliffhanger, so I'm really keen to pick up the rest of the books in the series, but it doesn't necessarily bother me, one, because all the books are out, and two, because they're so short. You know, it's the kind of thing where it could have been like a full-length novel, but they're self-published, so I totally get why the author did them as short stories. I have the other two, they're all available on Kindle Unlimited. I highly recommend reading them. BookTube's very own Murphy Napier narrates the audiobook, so if you're interested in that, you can listen to her narrate them. But I really enjoyed this story, and I find it so difficult to talk about books that are so short. But I really thought that the mystery elements of the plot were very engaging, which, as you know, is not something that is always the case for me. I liked the characters. I'm interested to see what's going to happen. And then finally, for the Aphrodite prompt, I read Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe, which is set in San Francisco? I think it's set in San Francisco. It's set in Chinatown in San Francisco during the Red Scare. There is a little bit of discussion of communism, but that isn't kind of the main point of the story. The main point of the story is that we're following Lily, who is 17, and she's a lesbian. But that's not really a thing right now. It's, you know, semi-illegal. Within her family, it's unacceptable. Within society, it's unacceptable. And she doesn't, you know, she knows, but she doesn't really know. So this is another one about exploration and discovering who you are and accepting who you are, even if those around you don't. And having to learn to live with the fact that you aren't accepted for the person that you are. This was really, really powerful. I really enjoyed it. I think Melinda Lowe is a fantastic writer. This is the second book by her that I've read. I have another one of hers on my shelf to read. She's an excellent LGBTQIA 2S+ author, and I highly recommend this. It's new. It only just came out this year. I think it came out in maybe March, April time, so it should be fairly easy to get hold of, even through your library. Although it's historical fiction, it doesn't really feel super historical because it's such recent history, but it's kind of, you know, it's post-World War fiction. I don't like World War fiction, but this is post-World War fiction, so it still worked for me. Very character-driven, not really about plot at all. I thoroughly enjoyed this one, and it's one of very few historical fiction books that I can really say that about. So, really well done. And that is it. Again, you can't really see the extent of this pile, but it's not looking too precarious. But so that I don't test it too much, I am going to go ahead and end this wrap up now. Hopefully you've found some books on this list that you're now interested in reading. If you've read any of these already yourself, do let me know what you think, and keep an eye out for those videos that I mentioned coming soon, talking about the ones that I didn't talk about here. Don't forget to check out Ponderful Books down in the description, and that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks, bye!